Now we're going to be talking about different changes that take place in the adolescent brain. And ultimately, what we're thinking about is how these changes are affecting those different ways of thinking, of different ways of knowing, different ways of processing information. Um, so, when we're talking about changes in the brain, we can examine both structure. So, if areas of the brain are growing, if they change shape, if they change connectivity in some ways. But more often than not, we're studying functioning. So we're studying how, again, with this connectivity, this is more of an issue of functioning. How are areas of the brain related to processing information and areas of the brain related to emotions? How are those connected to one another in a way that is affecting how we go about our lives? So there are different ways that we can test these changes in the brain. As you see here, fMRI, PET scans, MRI, CT scans. More often than not, we're using fMRI and MRIs in order to make sense of these changes in the brain. So I'm going to go through some of the main changes that take place in the brain during this period known as adolescence. One of the big changes that takes place in the brain is that we're still undergoing this process of pruning and how our synapses are remodeled and different connections are being made. So we talked a lot about this in childhood, but this is a process that's still taking place in adolescence. How this is helping us in adolescence, again, is still under this use it or lose it idea that if you need certain skills, we're going to strengthen those skills. If you don't need certain skills or abilities, we're going to lose those. And so ultimately, how this is helping us is this is leading to more efficient and focused processing. Again, doing the things that we need to do in our roles as adolescents, and then moving forward, how these things are going to be helping us in adulthood. Another change that's taking place, again, this is more along the lines of changes in the brain that have to do with functioning, is that the levels of neurotransmitters, or these hormones or chemicals in our brain, are changing during adolescence. The biggest changes that take place are in dopamine and serotonin. If you remember from Intro to Psych or other courses, dopamine is part of our reward system. And you see here that in adolescence, dopamine levels actually go up. Serotonin is related to multiple areas of functioning, but things that are related to sleep, to mood. If you think about somebody who may be having depressive symptomatology, we often talk about how their serotonin levels are lower than in somebody who doesn't have depressive symptomatology. And so what you see here in adolescence is that we have increased dopamine levels and decreased serotonin levels. How does this affect us as adolescents? For dopamine, essentially when we are having some kind of activity or engaging in some kind of activities that is rewarding. So let's say we are hanging out with friends. That might raise our dopamine levels because we really like our friends. If you are somebody who really likes chocolate, and chocolate has actually been shown, particularly in women, to raise dopamine levels, like or something that is really satisfying. If you, not you specifically, but people do drugs, it often works by raising dopamine levels. So our reward system is activated. That's at normal levels. In adolescence, if you are normally at a certain level, like your normal level, I'm just going to again put it on a scale because like, you can't see me at this moment, but let's say we have a scale of 0 to 10. Before adolescence, your dopamine level was at a 5, all right? So that means that in order to feel good, to feel these rushes of reward, you have to do whatever, again, eat some chocolate, engage with people, do drugs, again, not endorsing that. But then your dopamine level raises to a 7 and you feel that reward. Now, in adolescence, let's say your dopamine levels, again, not by doing anything, but just because of the way hormones work, your dopamine levels are already at a 7 or at an 8. What do you have to do in order to get that normal feeling of reward? or a rush. You have to do even more than you had to do before in order to feel that good sensation. So when you think about adolescence and risk taking, think about dopamine. Could it be one factor that's playing a role here? With the idea that maybe before adolescence, I could do something, like not that significant, and I would still feel that reward, that rush. But if my levels are already heightened, I need to do even more in order to just basically feel normal, in order to feel that rush. For serotonin, as I already mentioned, individuals with depressive symptomatology sometimes have lower serotonin levels. So how does this look? What does this look like in adolescence? If adolescents already have lower than average serotonin levels, this could mean that they're more emotional, or moodier, or more responsive to stress. They're just sensitive to that because they're already at a lower level. So just keep this in mind when we're thinking about the changes that are taking place in adolescence, not just cognitively, but broadly when we're interacting with them. Could these changes in part be due to these changes in the levels of neurotransmitters of which they have no control? There are individual differences. Not every adolescent is having extreme increases in dopamine or extreme decreases in serotonin, but by and large, again, on average, adolescents are experiencing changes in these levels. Now let's talk about changes in the structure of the brain. Um, One of the key take-home findings that I really want you to pay attention to or make note of throughout this whole discussion and this whole section on adolescence broadly is that the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain right in the front, is not fully mature until early adulthood. This area of the brain is responsible for many things, but among them are our executive functions, so planning, decision making, thinking through problems, setting goals, thinking about thinking, just any kind of working memory taking place in the prefrontal cortex. What does this mean for adolescence? If we don't have this area of the brain fully mature until we are, let's say, 25 years old, does this mean that adolescents aren't able or aren't as able to do these things well, to make good decisions, for example? These are questions that are still being investigated. We also know that there's better connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system. The limbic system is responsible for a lot of different things, but one of the big things, take-home message, is emotions. So this is saying essentially that our prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain that's thinking about thinking or working through information, and our emotional system are better connected during adolescence. This means that we're coordinating thoughts and feelings with one another. This means that we're better able to think about our own emotions. This means that we're better able to emotionally regulate. Not saying this is perfect in adolescence because these connections are being made and it's a complicated process, but that this is happening at a level that is not happening in childhood. We also have increases in structural changes in the working memory areas of our brains. So again, thinking back to information processing, we see that that's happened or we see those findings in research. And then increased myelination. And if you recall from when we were talking about this in childhood, this is idea that this is the fatty substance around the axon of the neuron, which leads to increased processing speed. So again, similar to what we were seeing with information processing theory, we can actually see this at the level of the brain.